All right, let's get down, let Paul speak to us. We're on the paragraph of Romans 12 that begins with verse 9. And this is one of the typical Pauline closings. I once preached a series of sermons based on Paul's final. It's almost like he, when he gets down to the end, and by the way, people talk about that the book of Romans has 2 or 3 different ends, or places that you might end. Of course, Paul had a reason for it. But here, he typically takes a bunch of admonitions. It's called paranesis. It means describing proper conduct. And it was important to Paul because for Paul, the center of God's activity is the church. And Protestant people, starting with the Protestant Reformation, were so fed up with the practices of the medieval Roman Church that they downplayed the importance of the church. And that subtly warps our understanding of Paul, because for Paul, the whole point of the new covenant was to form a new people of God, brought together by common faith in the faithfulness of God in Christ Jesus. And that the church was the important, it was an important thing. And when he gets toward the end of his letters, he tells us how to behave properly in the church. And that is as important as getting into it by salvation through faith, by grace through faith. And only fairly recently, I'd say in the last 30 years of Bible scholarship, have people began generally, I'm talking about big-time scholars, to generally realize how important the church is in Paul's writings, because that was the end purpose. He even has the idea, you know, we have in our revised church purpose statement, we are the living presence of Christ in every neighborhood in San Antonio and beyond. That is very Pauline. And because I've just been reading N.T. Wright's discussion of Galatians, where he discovers that in Galatians, Paul sees us to, as he says in 3:26 and 3:27 of Galatians, we were baptized into Christ, we put on Christ, and then he says, we become Christ. We are then the living presence of Christ. That's how important Paul saw the church to be. And it heartened me to find that Oak Hills had discovered that through a process of study. Just like the idea of the narrative history of God's people that we call the story. And last time I knew, there were 1,900 churches all over the world that were using the material that we use to study about the story. Zondervan's made us a deal that they would furnish all the materials we needed to study for nothing if we would allow them then to copyright it and sell it to other churches. And that's a great deal. It didn't cost us any more, because our two preachers, one of them's not on the payroll, hasn't been since about the third year he was here. Max is not taken. When I first moved back here in '91, what would be paid to him was being sent to a missionary in Brazil and supporting a whole missionary family. And as far as I know, he hasn't taken any money since then from the church. But anyway, it was free. And I want you to realize this part of the book of Romans is dealing with that idea of being the living presence of Christ in a world that does not know Christ. That's what we are. And that's the way we need to function. Now, again, remember, this is in a section where he has used the image, the metaphor of a human body, so that every part of that body supplies something. I wish I could be more active in the neighborhood groups than I can be. I have to choose. And since I have taken on a pretty good amount of work in translating the New Testament, more work than I realized. But God has been merciful and kind, and I've been doing reasonably well physically in doing that. So that's the function that I'm doing right now, and teaching 2 classes. Remind you again, starting probably about the last Wednesday in August, or the first Wednesday in September, I will start a class on Wednesday night teaching the book of Revelation. Okay, we did this a little bit. Love without hypocrisy. Now, you could spend days on that single little sentence. And the idea is, remember that the biblical definition of love, agape love, is the willed commitment to the well-being of other people, regardless of how you happen to feel about them. I've spent the last 35, 40 years of my life emphasizing that biblical love is not a feeling. It's a choice. And it's presented as a choice. Now, just when he finishes that, he says, abhor what is evil. Instead, be married to what is good. Now, that is a literal translation of the Greek. And to marry means to become one with. And so you are so intimately choosing good that it becomes you. There's a principle that was first enunciated about 1880 in the early depth psychology movement. It was called the active principle. And it can be stated this way: it is far easier to act your way into better feelings than it is to feel your way into better actions. In other words, you can choose your actions. And that's what the Bible teaches about love. You choose to love. And I'll guarantee you something. If you commit yourself to the well-being of another person, you've got about a 98 to 99% chance of eventually feeling affection for them. I had a couple that I thought had wronged me, and on the abstract level they did. And every time I thought about them, I felt sad and kind of put down and all. And I said, now that's not good. And I started praying every day for their success and well-being. And you know what happened? It took about a year, but I suddenly realized I felt very kindly toward them. I commit that to you for dealing with people that you think have wronged you. It's that act as if. You start acting, and people say, oh, that's hypocritical. No. Hypocrisy is acting in a way you never want to be. This is acting like you want to be in order to become that. It's completely different, psychologically and spiritually. And so you'll notice Paul knew that principle, even though he never heard of depth psychology.
Was he getting into that when he uses the phrase, put on this and put on that? He's telling them to act in a certain way.
Yes, and right here he's
the love of Christ. Or
yeah, that's what he's doing right here. So he says, love without hypocrisy, abhor what is evil, be affectionate in your love for your fellow believers. Now that's the first time he deals with affection, which is feeling good toward people. And the way if you have some fellow believer that just rubs you the wrong way, you start praying for them. And the affection will come. Try to outdo each other in showing respect. Now, this is raising a point that is perhaps the least understood about the difference between their culture and ours of all things. I didn't even know it existed until it was 1991 that I went to a biblical archaeology review weekend. That my going away present from the elders in Falls Church, Virginia, the elders of the church there, was a weekend at a biblical archaeology review, and it started. You had lectures Friday night, all day Saturday until noon Sunday, at a big hotel. They paid all my expenses and all. And it perhaps taught me more since it was focusing on the Old Testament, but it also, remember, that was the scriptures of the early church, of the first century church. And I learned about this principle. They lived in an honor-shame society. Now, just to show you how hard it is for us, we do not live in an honor-shame society. We live in an innocent guilt society. Now, I'm going to have to go a little deeper into that. Every culture has some way they try to get people to conform to the values of that culture. It's called socialization. And I wrote an article for the Crossings years ago about, have you been correctly socialized? And my lead sentence was, I'm not talking about socialized in the sense of becoming a socialist. It's a term used by social psychologists to mean disciplined according to your culture. And in an honor-shame society, They use honor and shame to get people to conform to the values of their society. In an innocent guilt society, they use guilt. It's amazing. I remember a book by, and I cannot think of his name now. He was a member of the Christian Reformed Church in Michigan, and he wrote humorous books about religious subjects. He talking about a church that was so liberal they had a sacrament for divorce. And he, you know, sometimes when I stop using illustration, I can't remember what I'm illustrating. But he had this idea about guilt and how it's used. And we still do that. Oh, I remember he had a character in it that didn't believe in God. He was an atheist. And somebody asked him, don't you feel guilty about all the women you've had sex with? And he said, no, I don't feel guilty about it. He said, sometimes though I do feel guilty about not feeling guilty. See, the society he lived in told him he ought to feel guilty. Even if he didn't theoretically believe he had done anything wrong, that teaching got to him. Now, that's not the way it was done in the ancient Near East. It was honor and shame. And to show you how hard it is for us to make that transition in our minds, just think about how difficult it is for us to understand the thinking of Arabic-based Muslims. Honor is above everything else. A lot of the horrible things that, from our perspective, that Muslims do, like killing young girls because they're no longer pure, they brought shame to the whole family. And there's just no way that we comprehend that. But that's closer to the idea that was in the New Testament time, and it's one of the things that we miss. In my translation, I try to bring that out. You remember the great day of questioning? That is when the Pharisees came, the scribes, the Sadducees asking Jesus trick questions, and he put them all down. And it says that he did such a good job that nobody dared any longer to ask him questions. And immediately the people that read that the first time would realize that means Jesus is a hero, because he triumphed on the field of honor. And have you ever heard anybody tell you that? But it's true. Now, I do my best to bring that out in a translation, but it's very difficult to do. And so when Paul says here that try to outdo each other in showing respect, he's talking about honor. He's talking about not hogging the limelight, that you try to respect all people. Now, one of the problems that Paul faced in the churches he wrote to was the fact that they had a small group of upper class people they generally were known as patricians in a Roman, and most of the people, as he says to the church in Corinth, are not of that class. There's not many of you of the upper class. And I translated upper class in Corinthians to bring that out. And one of the things that happened was that the patrician class, that is, people of the upper class, they felt that they were natural-born leaders. And so they wanted to run the church. And since churches met in little groups of 20 to 30 in private homes, if it happened to be the home of a patrician, they intended to run it. I can tell you the name of one of them. Diotrephes. Does that name mean anything to you? Well, if you read 2nd or 3rd John, it will be. He lorded it over the church. And he wouldn't even allow messengers from John to speak to the church that met in his house. And for years I couldn't understand that at all. But what it was, he was a patrician class. He lived in a big home, and he had a church that met there, and you better believe he's going to run that church. Now, that's what happened in Corinth. That's what the reason some people, when Paul's talking about the Lord's Supper, some people eat and drink till they're satiated and drunk, and other people go hungry. Because when the whole church got together, they met in some rich person's house. And they brought all of the lower class people with them. And according to the custom of the time, they ate in the dining room, and the lower class ate in the kitchen and in the hallways. And they didn't see any reason not to do that in the church. And Paul is saying here, instead of that, you count other people of more honor, worthy of honor and respect than yourself. There's no place in the church for patricians and proletariat. There's no place in the church for upper class and lower class. One of the great stories I know is a Church of Christ in California. And they had 2 elders. And one of the elders was a man named Green, who taught classic literature in the University of Southern California. And the other elder was the janitor in the building in which he taught. And people said you couldn't tell the difference between the two. They honored one another. They worked together in harmony. Now, see, we still have a little residual. It's not, in fact, most of us would be offended by having people that think they're better than we are. And just get right down to it. When Paul says here, don't think better of yourself than you ought to. Count each other worthy of respect. He uses the word outdo one another. In other words, get in competition to see how much you can honor the other person more than yourself. That's a pretty radical idea. And yet, that's what Paul sees. Becoming a Christian changes your worldview. You're no longer a rich banker. You're no longer a janitor. You are brothers in Christ. In fact, Paul went so far as to say, really, you're no longer masters and slaves. but brothers. And people say, well, why didn't he just teach against slavery? Well, I'm not going to try to get into that, but it would have been absolutely without effect. I'm going to use, at the danger of riling some feathers, I'm going to use an example from today. Whether we want it or not, homosexuality is going to be accepted as a societal norm. And there's not anything that I know that I can do about that. It's already anti-gay marriage statutes in 16 states have already been declared null and void. And one of those court cases, or maybe they'll be collected together in a single case, will go to the Supreme Court. And I'm not a political prophet, but there'll be at least 5-4 and probably 6-3 not saying it is illegal to bar homosexuals from getting married. So, what are we going to do? We're just going to be what we've always been. Believe what we have always believed, and let the devil take the hindermost. Now, I know that there's a lot of people who don't want to believe that, but I'm giving you the best. I've studied the political and judicial system of this country since I was a junior in high school, and that's my honest opinion.
It's just another step in getting Jesus here sooner.
What?
It's just another step in getting us to heaven sooner.
But don't you think too, I mean, the reason I feel like that Jesus and Paul and others who were New Testament and Old Testament writers didn't take those issues on is because they really aren't important. They're passing issues.
Well,
They're important to you personally for your own salvation.
Yeah.
But my goodness, your life goes so quickly. You
Yeah.
need to stay focused on
yes,
Christ.
and as I've told people, in this country, Christian believers have been living in a fool's paradise since the founding of this nation.
What, God is not an American?
What?
God is not an American?
I didn't hear it.
I said God is not an American?
No, I'm afraid not. Jesus was a Jew.
From the Middle East?
Yeah. And that's remember, in the church, those distinctions, Paul says, are null and void. Paul did teach against slavery, and it was a much less onerous slavery than what we practiced in the pre-Civil War South. There was no racial divide. The odds were that if you stayed a slave long enough, you would get your freedom. And if you got your freedom, guess what? Your master would be responsible for getting you a job and taking care of you. He was a patrician, say, and he had his followers. And that was a responsibility. But what I'm getting at here is we should triumph over our society and the socialization we have had as citizens if in any way it conflicts with biblical teaching. And yet that's hard to do. And Paul recognized that it was hard to do.
Hard to separate God and country.
Yes. So Paul, and every time he could get a lick in, he did. And eventually, do you know that slavery disappeared from most places in the world? But there's still slavery and slave markets in the world.
Human trafficking.
Yes, and some human trafficking for worse than just work slavery. But the point I want to get at is, here, what we can learn from this is our social norms that violate the equality of all believers are null and void and should not play any role in the church. It's the reason I've had the vision for Oak Hill since I came here in 1971 of an inclusive church. And friends, we have an inclusive church. Just sit down in the hallway outside the worship center and watch the people come out. There's Chinese and Japanese. There's black and white and brown. And people that I can't determine what they are. We have a pretty wide range of people here. We have people coming out of there whose net worth is up in the tens of millions of dollars. At one time we had a member who was probably worth $1 billion. He was president of AT&T. He's no longer here because they moved to Dallas. But we have, and then we have people that live on a bare minimum wage. There's people here that the church has to supplement food for them. And that's the way it should be. I don't know the social, economic level of everybody in this class, but it's a pretty wide range of social, economic people, even in this class. And what Paul is telling us here, don't let those distinctions hinder you from loving and serving all fellow believers. Listen as he goes on. Don't allow slothfulness to dim your commitment as you act as slaves for the Lord. Now, I've told you that I'm going to eliminate the idea of slavery because their slavery was so much different from ours that to use the term slave is misleading in an American translation. Servants totally obedient to the Lord is the way I'm going to. I wrote it down in my margin. That's what?
Servants, say that again?
Servants totally obedient to the Lord. See, that's what a slave was. They were totally obedient to their master. And so I'm going to put down a descriptive phrase, just like I've thrown out the word scribe in the Gospels, because I tried it here in this class. I asked people, what did they think of when they read the word scribe? And every one of you that spoke up said you thought about somebody who sat down and wrote. And that's not what they were. They were people authorized by the society they lived in to interpret the law. I didn't want to call them rabbis because the rabbinate was just in its beginning infancy then. It wasn't until 90 AD that a special class of people became designated as rabbis, even though the word is used in the New Testament.
It could be lawyers too, but that had a bad connotation.
Well, some translations translate them as lawyers, but that is almost as misleading as scribe, because they did not advocate for people. And that's what we think about a lawyer. So I want to, this is just so that we get the language that is meaningful today.
What do you mean by slothfulness?
What?
What did you mean by your interpretation? Slothfulness.
Lazy?
In what context?
What?
In what context?
He said to dim your commitment. In other words, don't be so lazy that you don't do what the Lord wants you to do with respect to the world and other fellow believers.
So a spiritual commitment, or was it just laziness in lifestyle, or what kind of laziness?
Well, it would be the idea. I'm going to use a concrete example and try to get it over that way. Perhaps you're listening to a sermon and you're stimulated by that sermon to do something for God. And then you leave and you eat lunch and you all this, and you think about that, and okay, I'll do that tomorrow. Kind of Scarlett O'Hara, I'll think about that tomorrow. And you just let laziness, see, does that help you understand?
It's more of it's a spiritual context.
Yes.
A commitment.
Yes.
The Amplified puts it this way: never lag in zeal and in earnest endeavor.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, more of that attitude. How do you receive the seed?
Yep.
Of the word?
See, I toyed with the idea of putting the phrase spiritual inertia here.
Yes.
And I may yet do that because that really gets to the point. See, it takes energy to overcome inertia. And sometimes we can be so habituated that, this comes first, job comes first, this, that, and we get so committed to other things that we don't get out of our rut, that kind of thing. Does that help you?
Yes. Yes.
Charles,
Nope.
it's the same writer who said the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak.
Yeah.
The flesh is lazy. slothful.
Yes, yes. That's you know my story about that. Had a young man when I was preaching in Brookline, Massachusetts. He was getting his degree in artificial intelligence at Harvard, and he was working on a translation program. He later went from there. He got a doctorate in that and taught electrical engineering at University of Indiana. And their first attempt at getting a translation program, they would translate from English to another language, then take that and translate back to English and see what it did. So they took the phrase, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak, and translated it into Russian, and then translated the Russian back into English. And it came back as, the vodka is strong, but the meat is rotten. So, oops. So they knew that that they had to do some work on the translation. Now they have really good translation programs. You can get one for your iPhone, and you can put any phrase that you in a foreign country into it, and make sure you're got the right parent language and the right receptor language, and it'll give you back in your own language. Okay, Let's go on. Be joyful in hope. Now, hope is one of those phrases, one of those words that is so much different in the Bible than it is in common language that I wish there was another word, but I cannot find another word. Hope, you know, we say, well, I hope so, meaning it's problematic, but hope in the biblical sense is a solid. Remember, faith is the essence of things hoped for. It's based in faith. If the Christian hope is as sure as Christ and the work He did. So hope, see, the idea here is let your hope of being with Christ build on Randy's sermon this morning. Keep you cheerful. I get tired of hearing believers pour mouth everything. Do you know what I mean by, as the saying used to be in East Texas, po mouth? You know, in other words, everything is going to hell in a handbasket. But you know what? You're not if you're a believer. That's what hope is.
If you really look at the words to my hope is built on nothing less than
Yes.
Jesus' blood and righteousness.
That's exactly right. Thank you for bringing that point up. So he says, there's no room in the church for people that are always down in the mouth. But he recognizes that will happen. I'll show you what I mean. Be patient in hope, joyful in hope, patient in affliction. That is, if you have things bad happening to you. Mina has had a really rough time since the Friday before Christmas. And she's still on pain medication. We've cut down. It's only about a third as much as she was. And she's resumed doing a lot of things in housework. And she gets around with a cane or even without a cane. So she's improving, but she's been very patient. There's been a few times that she would lose it. And my job has always been to be there and to put my arms around her and say, it's going to be all right.
Encourage.
Yes. And after a few tears, she brightens up. That's patient under affliction. See, you can be afflicted and not be suffering because you believe in Christ. You can just be suffering. To be honest with you, there's not a day that my back and legs don't hurt for some period of time during that day. It can be so mild that I'm hardly aware of it, or it can be so severe that I wonder if I'm going to be able to take the next step. You know what? The next day dawns, and it's a new day. The pain may be there, it may not be. So I have learned to be patient and do a minimum amount of work, no matter how I feel. Now, I'm not trying to be a hero of the faith. I'm sharing with you what this passage means. And I suspect that a lot of you could do the same thing. I've talked with a lot of you, and you have this ailment or this pain or that pain. And I can tell on your faces, and you can tell on the way that you move. There's enough affliction to go around. You don't have to go borrowing it from other people. Faithful in prayer. And that's something, that little 3-element mantra there would be good to memorize. Joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. That will get you through a whole lot of things. Share your means with needy saints. Now, that was one of the things that marked the New Testament church and early church on it. Do you know that one of the things that finally brought the persecution of Christians down in the Roman Empire, yes, I know Constantine became a Christian and that, but before that, the church was being accepted in greater and greater numbers. Tertullian, who was a writer in the 200s in North Africa, describes it. They had a plague. It was probably bubonic plague. And all the upper class people fled. All the Roman officials fled. They got in naval boats and went to islands out in the Mediterranean. You ever read the Decameron? Boccaccio's Decameron? That's a group of people that ran away and got in a castle during the so-called Black Death in the 14th century in Europe. And they tell stories to each other, and that makes it up. But anyway, the only people that stayed and nursed the sick were Christians. When the plague was over, there were more Christian believers in North Africa than there was before the plague started. I know a case like that. Whether you remember the first civil war in Nigeria back in the 69 and 70, the Biafran War it was called. Had a friend who had been a missionary in Nigeria, and he had to leave because of the Civil War. And thousands of Christians died in concentration camps and from hunger. And yet, when he went back after the Biafran War, there were more Christian believers in Nigeria than there was when the war started. That's how powerful our influence can be if we live up to God. Take care of the needy. Show hospitality to traveling missionaries. Hospitality was not a virtue among the Greco-Roman culture. You did not just allow people to come into your home. You were very selective about who you invited into your home. But Christian missionaries would go from place to place, and they would be like, what's her name? That seller of purple? Lydia. If you think my faith is real, come stay in my home, and Paul did. And that was one way the church grew, was going from place to place. And hospitality played a major role in the spread of the gospel in the first 400 years.
It's like the story Randy tells about his neighbor.
What?
It's that little story that Randy tells about his neighbor.
Yeah.
You know, where he kept inviting him over to activities and things like that. That's a form of hospitality.
Yes, it is. Okay, it is time